The night pressed down on him with a quiet cruelty as he stood in the small neighborhood grocery store, the kind of place where the aisles were narrow and the lights buzzed like tired insects. Outside, rain tapped against the fogged windows, blurring the street into a smear of reflections, but inside everything felt painfully clear. He held his wallet open, staring at the few coins and wrinkled bills as if they might multiply through sheer will. His daughter slept in the stroller beside him, wrapped in a thin blanket, her tiny fingers curled as though holding on to a dream he was afraid to disturb. She had cried earlier, the weak, hungry cry that had been haunting him for days, and now her silence felt heavier than the sound ever had. He moved slowly along the shelf, comparing prices, choosing the cheapest options without hesitation, knowing that dignity was a luxury he could no longer afford. Bread, diapers, a small jar of baby food. Each item felt like a small victory and a small defeat at the same time. When he reached the milk section, he stopped completely. The cartons stood there in neat rows, innocent and unforgiving. He knew how much they cost. He also knew he didn't have enough. His chest tightened, and for a moment he considered putting everything back, walking out, pretending he could fix this later. But later didn't feed a child tonight that he leaned closer to the stroller and brushed his finger gently against his daughter's cheek. She stirred, her lips moving slightly, and the guilt hit him so hard it felt physical. He whispered apologies he had said 100 times before, promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Since her mother had died, the world had felt like a place that demanded answers he didn't have. He had taken any job he could find, slept less than he should, learned how to be both parents at once, but still it never seemed to be enough. The cashier cleared her throat, the sound sharp with impatience, and he realized he had been standing there too long. Heat rushed to his face as he closed the wallet and reached for the stroller handle, ready to turn away from the milk, ready to accept another quiet failure. That was when he heard her voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority, the kind that made people listen without realizing why. "You need milk for your daughter." He turned, startled, meeting the eyes of a woman he hadn't noticed before. She stood a step away, dressed simply but with an effortless elegance that didn't belong to this place. Her gaze moved from the stroller to his face, taking in the exhaustion he could no longer hide. There was no pity in her expression, no judgment, just certainty. He swallowed and nodded, words stuck in his throat. She glanced at the shelf, then back at him, and said something that made his breath catch. "And I urgently need a husband." For a second, the world seemed to tilt. The buzzing lights, the rain outside, the hum of the refrigerator units all faded into the background. He waited for her to smile, for the joke to reveal itself, but it never came. Instead, she pulled a carton of milk from the shelf, placed it in his trembling hands, and stepped toward the counter. He followed in a daze as she paid for everything without hesitation. The cashier's attitude changed instantly, her voice suddenly sweet, her movements quick. He wanted to protest, to refuse, but the words wouldn't form. Pride felt like a distant memory compared to the relief flooding his chest. When the transaction was done, the woman turned to him and handed over a simple card, white with black lettering, an address printed neatly beneath a name. "If you want to understand what I meant," she said quietly, "come here tomorrow." Then she walked away, her footsteps steady, leaving him standing there with a bag of groceries, a sleeping child, and a future that had just cracked open in the most unexpected way. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist. He stood under the awning for a long moment, staring at the card, replaying every second of the encounter, searching for logic. People didn't make offers like that, not to men like him. Yet the milk was warm in his hand, real and undeniable. His daughter shifted in her stroller and let out a soft sound, almost a sigh, and something inside him loosened. He tucked the card into his pocket, pushed the stroller forward, and stepped into the night, unaware that the desperation of this moment was about to become the first turning point of a story far larger than he could imagine. He spent the night sitting at the small kitchen table, the card placed carefully beside a half-empty bottle of milk, as if both were equally fragile. Every time he closed his eyes, her voice returned with unsettling clarity, calm and direct, carrying a promise and a threat at the same time. By morning, exhaustion had softened into resolve. He dressed his daughter, kissed her forehead, and told himself he was only going to listen, nothing more. The address led him far from his neighborhood, past familiar streets into wide avenues lined with trees and quiet confidence. When the gates opened automatically, he almost turned back, convinced he didn't belong. But before doubt could win, the door opened and she was there, dressed for work, composed, as though inviting a stranger into her life was the most natural thing in the world. Inside, the house was bright and spacious, yet strangely empty, echoing with the absence of warmth. She motioned for him to sit and spoke without hesitation, explaining that time was her enemy. A clause buried in her family's business empire demanded marriage before a looming deadline, or control of everything she had built would be stripped from her and handed to people who saw her as expendable. She said she didn't believe in fairy tales, only in solutions, and right now, he was a solution she trusted. He listened in silence, his hands resting on the stroller handle, grounding himself. She outlined the terms clearly: a legal marriage, public appearances, honesty behind closed doors. No expectations of romance, no lies, no manipulation. In return, she would provide security, healthcare, education, and a future for his daughter that he could never reach alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but firm. He asked why she would risk everything on a stranger. She answered without flinching, saying she had watched him in the store, how he counted his money, how he almost walked away from the milk, how he never once asked for help. She said she needed someone who understood responsibility, not someone hungry for status. The words unsettled him more than the offer itself. No one had ever looked at him like that, as though his quiet struggle meant something. He asked for time to think, though both of them knew the answer was already forming. Over the next few days, they met again, discussing details that felt unreal, lawyers speaking in careful tones while his daughter crawled across polished floors. He learned that her world was ruled by expectations and contracts, while his had been shaped by survival and instinct. The contrast was jarring, but oddly complementary. He noticed how she softened around his child, how her guarded expression relaxed when tiny fingers grasped hers. She noticed how he listened more than he spoke, how his presence was steady, unassuming, grounding. On the evening before the deadline, she confessed that she was afraid, not of losing money, but of losing herself to a future she hadn't chosen. The honesty in her voice erased the last of his hesitation. The wedding happened quickly, deliberately understated yet impossible to ignore. Cameras flashed, whispers followed, and headlines bloomed overnight, questioning motives and mocking appearances. He stood beside her in a borrowed suit, feeling exposed, but when he felt her hand tighten around his, he understood that fear was something they would face together or not at all. Behind the public smiles, their private life began in cautious steps. They lived like polite roommates, learning each other's rhythms, navigating silences that were heavy with unspoken questions. He took on the role of caretaker naturally, managing the household, building routines for his daughter that brought a sense of normalcy to the grand space. She worked long hours, fighting battles he couldn't see, yet every night she came home to quiet understanding instead of judgment. Gradually, the house changed. Laughter replaced echoes. Shared meals replaced formality. They talked late into the night about things that had nothing to do with contracts or obligations. He spoke about loss and resilience, about learning to survive heartbreak without hardening his heart. She spoke about ambition and isolation, about being admired but never truly known. Trust grew slowly, deliberately, until it became something solid. When challenges arose, family scrutiny, public skepticism, calculated attempts to expose their marriage as a lie, he surprised everyone, including himself, by standing firm. He defended their union not with wealth or influence, but with integrity, reminding those who doubted him that commitment was more than a signature on paper. By the time the storm began to quiet, neither of them was pretending anymore. What had started as a strategic alliance had transformed into a partnership rooted in mutual respect. He no longer felt like an outsider in her world, and she no longer felt alone in hers. Together, they discovered that the strongest bonds are often forged not by love at first sight, but by choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. The first real crack in their carefully balanced world came quietly, disguised as routine, the kind of moment that only revealed its danger once it had already passed. He noticed it in the way the house staff suddenly avoided eye contact, in the way conversation stopped when he entered a room. Rumors had begun to spread, fed by relatives who resented his presence and rivals who saw him as a weakness to exploit. He tried to shield her from it at first, believing that his job was to absorb the discomfort so she could focus on the battles that truly mattered. But secrets had a way of growing heavier the longer they were carried alone. When she finally confronted him, anger and fear collided in her voice, not because she doubted him, but because she hated that he felt he had to endure the insults in silence. That night, they argued for the first time, not over the contract or appearances, but over pride and protection, over how much of themselves they were willing to expose to keep the other safe. The argument ended not with raised voices, but with exhausted honesty, both of them realizing that partnership meant standing together, even when it was uncomfortable. The attacks soon became public. A carefully worded article questioned his past, implying motives he didn't have and debts he had never owed. Photographs were taken out of context, his simplest actions twisted into evidence of manipulation. He felt the familiar weight of shame press against his chest, the old instinct to retreat, to disappear before he became a burden. She, however, refused to let him shrink. She brought him into meetings he had never been invited to before, insisting that his presence mattered. Watching her defend him with calm authority changed something inside him. He had spent so long believing his value was measured by what he could provide materially that he had forgotten the strength of his character. When she asked him to speak at a charity event they sponsored together, he nearly refused, terrified of saying the wrong thing, of confirming every doubt whispered about him. She reminded him that truth didn't need polish, only courage. Standing in front of that audience, he felt more exposed than he ever had in his life. The room was filled with people who had never known hunger or fear, people who looked at him with curiosity thinly veiled as judgment. He spoke anyway, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He talked about dignity, about the quiet heroism of parents who sacrifice without applause, about how strength was built in moments of choosing responsibility over ego. He didn't mention wealth or contracts or rumors. He spoke about love in its most practical form, about showing up every day even when no one was watching. The silence that followed was not the cold kind he had feared, but something heavier, thoughtful. Applause rose slowly, then filled the room. When he stepped down, she was waiting for him, her eyes shining with a pride that made his throat tighten. In that moment, he understood that he was no longer a guest in her life. He was a part of it. The backlash didn't disappear overnight, but its power weakened. People began to see the man behind the headlines, the father who carried his daughter on his shoulders through crowded halls, the husband who listened more than he spoke. At home, their bond deepened into something neither had expected. They began to argue less and laugh more, finding comfort in shared routines and private jokes. He learned to navigate her world with confidence, not because he wanted to belong, but because he already did. She learned to rest, to trust someone else with pieces of her life she had always guarded fiercely. One evening, after a particularly long day, she admitted that she had stopped thinking of their marriage as a solution to a problem. It had become her safe place. The admission stunned him, not because he didn't feel the same, but because saying it aloud made it real in a way nothing else had. Their pasts, once sources of distance, became bridges instead. He told her stories about his late wife, not with pain, but with gratitude, and she listened without jealousy, honoring the love that had shaped him. She shared memories of a childhood filled with expectations but little affection, and he listened without trying to fix anything, offering understanding instead. Trust grew in those moments, quiet and unremarkable, yet profound. When the next wave of opposition arrived, sharper and more personal, they faced it together, no longer reacting from fear, but from unity. They had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, and that standing in the open, unashamed, was the most powerful defense of all. The challenge that followed was not loud or public at first. It arrived in the form of a private ultimatum delivered behind closed doors, wrapped in polite language and false concern. Her family summoned her to a formal dinner, one where every smile carried an expectation and every pause felt calculated. He was invited as well, though it was clear from the beginning that his presence was part of the test. As they sat at the long table, conversation drifted toward legacy, responsibility, and the image of the family, words chosen carefully to avoid directly naming him as the problem while making it clear that he was. When the offer finally came, it was presented as generosity, a financial settlement, a comfortable home elsewhere, and continued support for his daughter, all in exchange for a quiet divorce that would restore the family's preferred order. The room went still, waiting for his response. He felt the old reflex to accept, to step aside so others could be more comfortable. But before he could speak, she placed her hand over his, grounding him. For the first time, he saw anger flash openly across her face, not for herself, but for him. She rejected the offer with a calm that carried unmistakable force. She reminded them that her marriage was not a mistake to be corrected, but a choice she stood by. When they questioned his suitability, she spoke of character, of how easily wealth confused value, of how strength revealed itself in humility and consistency rather than bloodlines and balance sheets. He listened in stunned silence, realizing that she was fighting not just for the marriage, but for the life they had built together. The tension in the room thickened, years of control and expectation colliding with a boundary they could no longer cross. When they left that night, the air outside felt lighter, as though a storm had finally broken. In the car, neither of them spoke for a long time. Words felt unnecessary. The understanding between them was complete. The consequences came swiftly. Business partners hesitated, deals stalled, and pressure mounted from every direction. She worked longer hours than ever, determined to prove that independence did not require isolation. He took on more responsibility at home, not as retreat, but as support, managing their lives with quiet efficiency so she could focus on what needed to be done. Their daughter thrived in the stability of their shared effort, her laughter a constant reminder of what truly mattered. Late one night, after another grueling day, she confessed that she was afraid she had asked too much of him, that her world was too heavy, too demanding. He answered without hesitation, telling her that he had spent his life carrying weight alone, and that sharing it now did not weaken him, it strengthened him. The sincerity in his voice left her speechless. As the weeks passed, they found themselves leaning on each other in new ways. Decisions once made alone became shared discussions. Victories, even small ones, were celebrated together. Losses were absorbed as a team. The line between obligation and affection dissolved completely, replaced by something deliberate and chosen. One quiet evening, as they watched their daughter fall asleep between them on the couch, she admitted what she had been avoiding for months. She told him she loved him, not out of necessity or gratitude, but because he had become the person she trusted most in the world. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. He didn't respond immediately, overwhelmed by the depth of the moment, then finally told her that he loved her too, not because she had saved him, but because she had seen him when no one else had. The final test came when a public inquiry threatened to dismantle everything she had built, fueled by those who still believed her marriage was a weakness. This time, she did not face it alone. He stood beside her, not as a symbol, but as an equal, answering questions with honesty, refusing to be intimidated. When asked why he stayed, he spoke of choice, of commitment, of the belief that family was defined by care, not convenience. The narrative shifted. What had once been framed as scandal began to look like resilience. When the inquiry concluded, leaving her position intact and her reputation stronger than before, they returned home exhausted but unbroken. In the quiet that followed, they reflected on how far they had come, from a desperate exchange in a grocery store to a life built on mutual respect. The urgency that had once driven them had transformed into something steady and enduring. They had faced power, prejudice, and fear, and emerged not untouched, but united. What remained was not the story others told about them, but the truth they lived every day, a truth rooted in loyalty, courage, and a love that had grown slowly, honestly, and without compromise. The morning that followed felt strangely ordinary, and that was how he knew everything had truly changed. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the house, warming the floors where their daughter sat building towers from brightly colored blocks, completely unaware of how much her laughter had anchored two uncertain adults to a shared future. He stood in the kitchen making breakfast, moving with a confidence that came not from wealth or comfort, but from belonging. When she entered the room, hair loose, eyes tired but peaceful, he realized that the tension which had once lived between them had finally dissolved. There was no contract hanging invisibly in the air, no unspoken deadline ticking away. What remained was choice, renewed each morning in small, ordinary ways. They talked about plans that had nothing to do with survival anymore. School events, vacations, dreams that extended beyond the next crisis. The simplicity of it all felt like a miracle. Public opinion shifted slowly but decisively. Articles that once questioned his worth began to focus on their partnership, on how her leadership had grown stronger, not weaker, since she had allowed herself to share it. He was no longer introduced as an unexpected husband, but as a devoted father and a steady presence at her side. He accepted the attention with humility, never seeking the spotlight, understanding that his role was not to shine, but to support. At charity events, people listened when he spoke, not because of who he married, but because his words carried lived experience. He advocated quietly for families like his once had been, for dignity in struggle and compassion in policy. She watched him from across crowded rooms, pride softening her features, realizing that the man she had once chosen out of urgency had become the partner she admired most at a tea home. Life settled into rhythms that felt almost sacred. They argued occasionally, as all real couples do, but now disagreements ended in understanding rather than distance. He learned when to speak and when to simply listen. She learned to rest, to let go of the belief that love had to be earned through achievement. Evenings were spent together on the couch, their daughter curled between them with a book, her head resting against his shoulder while small fingers reached for her mother's hand. In those moments, the world outside ceased to matter. They were no longer proving anything to anyone. They were simply living the life they had built. One afternoon, they returned to the same small grocery store where it had all begun. The aisles were unchanged, the lights still buzzing, the shelves still narrow. He paused by the milk section, memories rushing back with surprising intensity. She noticed and smiled softly, understanding without needing explanation. He placed a carton into the basket without checking the price, not out of carelessness, but out of gratitude for how far they had come. At the checkout, as they paid together, he felt a quiet sense of closure. The desperation of that night no longer defined him, but it would always remind him of the moment his life turned toward hope. Years passed, marked not by headlines or battles, but by growth. Their daughter thrived, confident and kind, raised in a home where love was shown through action. She grew up hearing the story of how her parents met, not as a fairy tale, but as a lesson in courage and compassion. He taught her that asking for help was not weakness. She taught her that choosing kindness was a form of strength. Together, they modeled a partnership built on respect, resilience, and honesty. The legacy they created was not one of wealth, but of values passed quietly from one generation to the next. On a quiet evening, long after the urgency that had once driven their lives had faded, they sat together in the garden, watching the sky darken into deep shades of blue. He reached for her hand, just as she had reached for his years before, and she leaned into him naturally, without hesitation. They spoke about nothing and everything, about the strange twists that had brought them together and the peace they had found by staying. In the stillness, he realized that the sentence which had once shocked him in a grocery store had been less a bargain and more a confession of shared need. They had not saved each other from their lives. They had walked into a new one together. And in that understanding, simple and profound, their story found its quiet, enduring end.